Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Les Smith. I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's conversation about the Wolverine World Wide Feasibility Study community meeting. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here. Before we get into our presentation this evening, I would like to go over a couple of items with you. First of which, I would like to introduce our evening presenter and supporting staff that will be answering questions later on this evening. First, I would like to introduce Karen Vorst. She's a project manager with the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy Remediation and Redevelopment Division. She's not on the screen, but she will be shortly. Next, we have Abby Hendershot. Abby is the incoming executive director for MPART, and she'll be here joining us as well for our question and answer session. And also joining us is Danielle Allison Yoakum with the Michigan Attorney General's Office, who also will be present as well. Next, I'd like to let you know, I want to talk about how we'll be proceeding for the rest of the evening during our discussion. So we do have a presentation that will be presented by Karen to provide you a summary of what's in this feasibility study that has been proposed by Wolverine World Wide. And then at the conclusion of that presentation, we will move into a question and answer session. Also, listen out through the presentation for some guidance on how to submit a formal written comment on the feasibility study. I know Karen will be covering that during her presentation. And also we will provide you with contact information on who to contact for additional questions. This webinar is being recorded, and we will have this webinar available following tonight's conversation. It will be in a few days. It will show up on EGLE's YouTube channel, and we will also have a link to the MPART webpage as well. Also wanted to let you all know that your lines are muted, but there is a way for you to have a conversation with this evening's panel. The way to do that is to type a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen in Zoom. You can type a question at any time during the webinar. If you have questions about something you see in the presentation, just write it in. There's also going to be an opportunity during the question and answer portion of the meeting to electronically raise your hand. For those of you who are watching the webinar, there's a hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom control panel for you to electronically raise your hand. And then we do have four listeners on the phone. And for those of you that are on the phone, you can electronically raise your hand by pushing the pound and the two buttons. Again, that's pound 2 to electronically raise your hand for those of you that are on the phone. And I'll go over that again when we get to the question and answer session. So with that, Karen, if you are ready, you can go ahead and share your screen and the presentation.
Great. It should be sharing right now. Can everybody see that?
Yes, I can.
Great. Okay, I'll turn on my laser pointer here. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your lovely Wednesday, I guess it is, evening to watch this important public meeting on Wolverine's draft House Street property feasibility study. As a lot of you already know, my name is Karen Vorst. I am a project manager here in the Grand Rapids District Office in the Remediation Redevelopment Division. And I'm the project manager for the House Street investigation, the Wolverine World Wide site here in Belmont, Kent County, Michigan. So this public comment period we are having on this draft feasibility study, it will be lasting until April 17th. And so you can submit your official written comments through us till midnight on April 17th or 11:59 p.m. And what I really hope is that you get out of this meeting, it will give you some more background information, enable you to better understand the contents of the draft feasibility study, also understand how it relates to the requirements of the consent decree, and just obviously it's really important for us to hear from the community and the general public, especially on plans such as these that have such a significant public interest. So tonight, we'll be going over the basic facts of the plan. You know, EGLE will not be giving our review or our comments on the plan, but rather we want to listen to you. There will be a time for questions and some informal comments after I finish my presentation. That's what we're kind of here for tonight. So basically how this meeting the agenda we have is we'll do a quick overview of the 2020 consent decree, as that's pretty important to some of the requirements that are in this feasibility study. There are some newer residents to the area that have reached out to me. Not everyone is as familiar with the history of the site and the location as some of you are who have been, you know, in on this for the last 4 years now. So I'll do a brief overview of the House Street property location just to orient everyone. Talk about the consent decree and what those requirements are as they relate to the House Street site itself. We'll go over some of the main portions of the draft feasibility study submittal that Wolverine did submit. And then we'll go over kind of a next steps, what we anticipate happening next with the report review, go over the official public comment period where you could submit written comments, go over if you need help with written comments, my contact information so I can help you with that if you need any assistance. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions. And if anyone also wants to, you know, ask any questions or give any informal public comments, we are here tonight to take those as well. So starting with the consent decree, as a lot of you know, but some may not, there is a legal agreement that governs Wolverine's response actions regarding PFAS here in the Northern Kent County area. It is a consent decree between the state of Michigan, Plainfield and Algoma Townships, and Wolverine. It became effective on February 19th, 2020, so just over a year ago now. It was signed by a federal court judge. And this, again, serves as the framework for all future PFAS response activities performed by Wolverine in what's called the North Kent Study Area. And so for those of you that are viewing this, you'll be able to see this figure on this slide. This shows basically it is the outline of what is considered the North Kent Study Area. It's highlighted in this gray, so it goes as far north as 12 Mile, as far south as the Grand River, west to Pine Island Drive, and as far east as downtown Rockford. Here you'll see the House Street disposal property outlined in this yellow, right here just west of US 131. And then you'll also notice Wolverine's former tannery property outlined in red down in downtown Rockford, as well as the Rogue River highlighted in this darker blue to accent that. Wolverine is required to conduct these activities that are outlined in the consent decree, and they are being done under EGLE oversight. If anyone is interested and hasn't already, the consent decree document in full is posted on our House Street kind of North Kent website. That's at www.michigan.gov/Belmont. So a lot of information is on there. So it has the text of the document and all of the appendices as well. And so just kind of some basic highlights of the consent decree. The reason why we're here tonight is for the House Street disposal site requirements that are specifically laid out in section 7.8. So if you open up that consent decree document, you can go ahead and read it from the beginning or just scroll to section 7.8 to see exactly what it says that's required for this. We'll go over that as well, but that's where it's located. We've had previous public meetings regarding some of the other work plans that are required, but again, there's been municipal water expansion requirements, filter operation and maintenance in areas not receiving municipal water, residential drinking water well sampling that is going to be ongoing. The tannery site in downtown Rockford, there's requirements for source control there. We'll be having an additional public meeting for that coming up. in May. So stay tuned for that. There'll be announcements on that on our websites. Obviously, there's a number of different groundwater investigations that are occurring in different areas of the North Kent study area. And then as well as an investigation along the Rogue River for the groundwater surface water interface investigation. So there is quite a bit going on, but again, tonight we're going to be focusing in on the feasibility study, the draft feasibility study for the House Street site. So the House Street property location, here is a topographic map. And right here, you'll see House Street outlined. This is approximately 76 acres. It's located in northern Kent County, just south of 10 Mile Road, just west of US 131. And you know why this site is important is, well, Wolverine historically used this property to dispose of waste materials from their downtown Rockford tannery. The waste products from the tannery since at least 1958 contained PFAS, specifically Scotchgard, which was used to waterproof leather shoes. A lot of you will remember the Hush Puppy line of shoes, and those were kind of debuted and started the Scotchgard use in 1958 at the Rockford Tannery. So as we move to the next slide in a little bit of the historical use, based on documentations that we've obtained during the consent decree and digging around, you know, there is reference to disposal as early as the late 1930s, early 1940s on House Street. However, Wolverine did not purchase the property until 1964. In 1966 was the first very bare-boned disposal laws in the state of Michigan that applied to disposal facilities in 1966. So this did get a license under that act. Really all that required was, you know, nuisance control, making sure you weren't attracting a bunch of rodents, surface cover and that kind of thing, a very basic law. There was no landfill design or any monitoring or anything like that back in the 1960s associated with that act. By 1970, disposal activities had stopped at the House Street site. So from about at least 1958 to 1970, you did have PFAS in particular mixed in the waste stream being disposed of at the House Street site. Wastes were disposed in unlined trenches, in ponds and lagoons, and also in a ravine area on the property. So right here, we have a 1966 site plan. It was associated with the license that they obtained in 1966. And some of these trenches were in use, some of them, a lot of these were proposed, but you can actually see hand drawn on here all the trenches that were proposed to be used. This is a haul road that lines up to pretty close to what is there currently. Up here to the north, again, this was kind of seepage lagoons, drainage lagoons. And right here is that deep ravine right along House Street, along this southern portion of the property. And the interesting thing is the site plan depicting all of this lines up pretty close to where the waste has been defined on the property. So when we move to this slide here, again, we have the outline of the House Street site. And in this purple material, kind of more on the central and west portion of the 76 acres, we have where the waste materials are located, or it could have been soils with waste material mixed in with them. So you just have straight sludges or soil with a little bit of the sludges mixed in with it. And this is figure 3 from the feasibility study. So it's in the report if you want to look at that closer. You can kind of see here was where that road was that went around that trucks would have used. And this is where the trenches would have been. Right down in here on the southern part is where that deeper ravine is. And so this was all defined and mapped out. It was gathered by Wolverine in 2018 and a little bit in 2019 under a US EPA unilateral administrative order that US EPA had Wolverine do quite a bit of work here. And then while Wolverine was there for EPA, we also had them sample for PFAS at the same time they were sampling for the non-PFAS contaminants for US EPA. And so obviously we have some issues from the waste materials leading to PFAS groundwater contamination. This is a figure 8F. It's pulled from a previous report. It is on our website if you're interested. It's the implementation of 2018 work plan summary report for House Street. This was a report that was submitted to US EPA. And here we just kind of have, again, this is the outline of House Street. House Street would be running along the south here. And this is kind of a three-dimensional model of the waste materials that exist on the property, as well as that's shown in the dark blue, kind of the royal blue, if you can see that. And then soil that's mixed with the waste is kind of the lighter blue, the aqua blue there. You know, when you add the waste and the soil mixed with waste together, you know, just general ballpark, you're at about 83,000 cubic yards of, you know, impacted waste and soils at the property. And so that's, you know, this is obviously why we're here tonight. This waste material needs to be addressed, remaining on the site. Here's a figure 4A. This is taken from the draft feasibility study. And here's House Street outlined, the property, and this is showing the groundwater contamination in the aquifer itself. So where the groundwater is in the ground, that's used for drinking water, or was previously used for drinking water prior to municipal water being installed here. And you can see how the highest concentrations in the groundwater kind of lines up pretty close to this deeper ravine where wastes have been disposed of and other things. And it definitely has a southerly flow. There's actually an old stream channel, paleo stream channel, that the PFAS has an affinity to flow down towards the Rogue River, which is to the southeast. And so the House Street site itself, for the most part, there is a lot actually superficial clay down to about 20 feet on the site. And unfortunately, when we found some documents, some older documents, there was some issues with the trenches draining because of that clay. Because again, it obviously wasn't allowing the water to drain down deep. So back in the day, you know, it was practiced to drill holes through that to allow for drainage. So that's really how the PFAS was able to infiltrate through that clay, the superficial clay that's there, and it may not be fully continuous across the site, but for the most part, we have seen it there. And then infiltrate down into where the groundwater is. There is a separation between that groundwater and the bottom of that waste. So kind of the first depth to the impacted aquifer is approximately 60 feet below the ground surface. The deepest part of the waste is about 20 feet down from the bottom of that ravine. So there is some separation distance, but obviously with surface infiltration, precipitation, that water moves through the waste, is able to make its way down to that aquifer where the groundwater is, and then migrate out. So that's why it is, you know, this feasibility study is important, and the remedy is important to cut off the infiltration of that precipitation through that waste to begin with. So we'll move on to the next slide. So this is where we get to the consent decree. And I just kind of wanted to go over the basics of that, because that obviously governs a lot of what we needed to see in the feasibility study, kind of the minimum requirements. And so in section 7.8, you know, A says Wolverine shall conduct a feasibility study of potential remedial options for the House Street disposal site. The feasibility study shall be submitted to MDEQ, which is us. We used to be MDEQ, Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. We were renamed to EGLE, or Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. So don't be confused when you see MDEQ, that's just us. We just like to change our names sometimes. So it had to be submitted to us within 1 year of the effective date. So that's why we received it on February 19th, 2021, 1 year later from 2020. And this is kind of really important, this next section. So 7.8A sub 2. The feasibility study shall evaluate the following remedy options to 1, manage solid waste at the House Street disposal site, and 2, reduce and control potential migration of PFAS compounds from soils and sludges into the groundwater from the House Street disposal site. So those are kind of the 2 main objectives that the feasibility study needs to meet per the consent decree. The next part of the consent decree kind of lays out the minimum options that have to be included and compared to one another. The first one being the approximately 30-acre surface cap without a bottom liner. It has to comply with Part 201, which is Michigan's environmental law. Also meet applicable requirements of Part 115. That is Michigan's solid waste management laws. That is overseen by EGLE's Material Management Division. So I'm Remediation Redevelopment. We oversee 201. And then our Materials Management Division oversees Part 115. So whatever option is picked, you know, it will need to meet the requirements of Part 115 that specifically relate to capping, building a landfill, waste management as well. So that's the first option, the 30-acre cap. Second option was approximately a 20-acre surface cap over which materials are consolidated, so moved together, put above a liner, so there will be a bottom liner. You have a bottom liner, a surface cap, and then obviously you're basically creating a landfill cell at that point, and so there will need to be leachate collection, which is all the things that build up in there and need to be treated and disposed of. It will need that collection system, and again, needs to comply with 201 and Part 115. The other option, and this is, you'll see some of the remedial options, remedies that they compared fall under C in this section, and that's other alternatives that may include some combination of a smaller cap, groundwater interceptor, collection, or treatment. And again, whatever other alternatives are submitted on that have to comply with 201 and meet applicable requirements of 115. And so when you get to 7.A sub 3, this is where, and you'll see modeled in Wolverine's document, these were kind of the minimum requirements that needed to be included in the feasibility study. So it had to compare, you know, the performance, the reliability, ease of implementation, any potential impacts that the remedy may have, safety impacts, you know, the time it's going to take to complete the remedy, costs of the remedy implementation, any sort of permitting or institutional requirements, and of course the remedy's ability to reduce toxicity and mobility of PFAS compounds. So these are kind of the minimum checklists that had to be included in the feasibility study. I also just want to note that this is being submitted theoretically under 201, but those requirements of Part 115 still apply, as well as any other requirements in the consent decree, like what we talked about, 7.A sub 2, those 2 kind of remedial goals of 1 and 2, reducing the potential migration of PFAS compounds off the site and managing solid waste. Those still apply to what is in this section. So now we're getting into Wolverine's draft feasibility study, which I know a lot of you have already reviewed and are in the process, if not already almost completed, with your official written comments. But for those of you who haven't, you know, been able to do that, or are just kind of interested in knowing what is in it, you know, it's really broken up into 6 sections. The first section is just an introduction, followed by section 2, which is the normal background information. Section 3 just kind of goes over the scope of what they are analyzing in this report. And then section 4 is really more of the detail area of this report that goes over the analysis and comparison of the remedy options. So Wolverine in 4.1, they have defined their own remedial objective in 4.1. 4.2, they go over identification and screening of remedy options. We're going to go over that in the next slide. I'm going to break that down a little bit for you. And then 4.3 is based on their initial screening in 4.2, they chose 6 different options to compare in this draft feasibility study. So again, the no further action option, the 30-acre cap option, the cap with the liner or the landfill option, that's number 3. Number 4 was a off-site disposal where basically they would dig everything up and transport it to a different landfill. 5 is a pump and treat option, which is basically sucking up the groundwater and treating it and discharging it back to the ground. And then number 6 was the phytoremediation and partial cap option. Section 5, they discuss which remedy they picked. And then section 6 is just some references that were referenced in the text above. There's also 2 tables, which we'll go over, attached along with 11 different figures. Some of those figures we will go over. Some of the other ones that I'm not including is just some of the cross sections of some of the waste material on the property. And then a good portion of the back end is Appendix A, where GZA provided some qualification documentation. GZA is Wolverine's consultant that will be doing the work. I should clarify that too. So focusing in specifically on section 4.2 and table 1, analysis of remedy options. So Wolverine initially compared 12 different remedy options, and that's laid out mostly on table 1. Those 12 options, they then whittled down to 6. So I'll read because I know there's some people on the phone, so I'll read the 12 options. I'll kind of briefly just explain the 6 options that they decided not to include, that they dismissed, just so you have at least some understanding of what they were. And then for the rest of the presentation, we're going to focus on the 6, or at least 5 of the 6 that they went into detail. And then of course, the option they chose we'll be discussing too. So option 1 of 12 was the no further action. It's kind of like the baseline thing, status quo. That's usually always included in a feasibility study, not that they would ever choose that one. That's just kind of the baseline. Number 2 was just doing access and use restrictions, pretty much very similar to the no further action, just putting on some deed restrictions. Number 3 is the 30-acre on-site cap without the bottom liner. Number 4 was the on-site containment cell, so the top and the bottom liner, the landfill cell. Number 5 was the groundwater pump and treat. Number 6 was what's called a funnel and gate system. It's discussed a little bit on table 2. I won't waste a lot of our time with it, but it is an option that they looked at, and basically it's a passive remediation method, which uses basically they kind of install some kind of wall in the subsurface that's called the funnel. It kind of tries to funnel the groundwater through what's called a gate, and in that gate is some sort of type of permeable adsorptive barrier that as the groundwater passes through that gate, the PFAS would be filtered out. Again, there's a lot of construction involved in things, but that's when you see funnel and gate system, that's just basically what it's referring to. They also looked at a deep well injection. There's deep well injections in the United States. It's called a class 1 well. They're usually used to inject hazardous and non-hazardous waste into deep confined rock formations. They're typically drilled thousands of feet below the lowermost underground source of drinking water. So I think last time I looked, there was less than 1,000 of these in the United States. So again, these are not usually a viable option, just because you need very specific geology conditions for it to be used safely. So that option was thrown out. The next one was in situ waste stabilization. And what that is basically when you add some amendments to the soil or the waste in this case to reduce the potential for PFAS to mobilize from that soil into the groundwater and surface water. You know, there can be adsorbing materials that are added that can be applied as well through this mixing in the soil. And all that it means with the in situ is that the treatmented materials are injected actually into the subsurface here. They're not like digging it up, mixing it, then putting it back. It's kind of done more in place. That's in situ approach. And so Wolverine discusses that. You can look at that section, and but that was something that they did look at. The next one is in situ thermal desorption treatment. Basically, again, sounds fancy. All that means is thermal treatment, so heat that will demobilize the chemicals using heat. And so that can be an option as well. So they dismiss that option, and you can see that discussed in table 1 as to why. So the heat is basically applied directly to the PFAS contamination in the soil. The next one, I think we're on number 10. The in situ chemical oxidation. Again, that just chemical oxidation just means you're injecting oxidants to neutralize or reduce toxicity of the chemicals, contaminants. So that, again, that's an in-place type of injection that has been used for a lot of non-PFAS contamination at different sites. There's a, you know, a lot, most of all of these are used at, have been used at other sites for non-PFAS, but they did look at that, and you can look at the write-up in table 1. The next one is excavation and off-site disposal, which they included in their review of the 6. That's, again, dig and haul. That's what we usually would call it. You dig it up, you haul it off-site in a gravel train, and it's disposed of. Usually with PFAS now, the material that was dug up from the tannery had to go to a hazardous waste landfill. Would only take it because there's a lot of landfills who don't want to accept PFAS waste, but there are landfills out there who are designed to accept even, you know, worse chemicals than PFAS, believe it or not, very, you know, highly hazardous levels of PCBs and other pretty nasty stuff. So there are landfills that do accept PFAS. It's just, you know, a little farther away. And then the last option, the 12th option, was the phytoremediation and capping option. So these 6 highlighted in yellow: the no further action, the on-site capping, the on-site landfill, the pump and treat, the excavation and off-site disposal, and the phytoremediation and capping are the 6 options that Wolverine chose to compare in their feasibility study. And again, this photo, this picture I have on the side just kind of shows again where we have the highest PFAS groundwater. This isn't soils or sludges, this is in the groundwater. Does kind of coincide with where that ravine is, and those trenches are right there on the southwestern part of House Street property. This is a figure that was included in the feasibility study as well. I believe that was figure 4. So now we're into section 4.3 in table 2. So this is the actual analysis of the selected remedy options. So again, I just laid out the 6, and based on their review of the no further action, the baseline option, the on-site capping, the landfill, the dig and haul, excavation, disposal, the pump and treat, and the phytoremediation and capping, based on Wolverine's analysis and their interpretation, they are proposing the phytoremediation and limited capping option. So that would theoretically fall, if you remember back to 7.8, there was A, B, and C. That would fall under C, and other alternatives analysis is kind of what they're submitting this under. So specifically on table 2, it's kind of shown in the text as well, but I'm a visual person. I like tables myself. They compare these 6 options based on the following categories. They have performance, reliability, implementability, potential impacts to the area, control of exposure to residual contamination, if any's left, time required, cost is involved in there, any institutional requirements, again, the permitting, the zoning, any land use restrictions, and then of course the remedy's ability to reduce toxicity and mobility of PFAS compounds. So in the next slides, we're going to focus in a little bit more on the on-site capping, the 30-acre cap, the on-site containment cell, also called the landfill cell. I'll briefly go over the groundwater pump and treat since that was included and just kind of give the overall concept so you understand what that is. And then obviously we'll go over the phytoremediation and capping option as well. The dig and haul, there's really no figure to show. The excavation and disposal, that again, that's just, they're going to dig up the waste, they're going to lay it, put it in gravel trains, they're going to dispose of it offsite. Then they have to backfill with clean soil and then regrade it. Obviously cut down a bunch of trees in order to get to where the waste is. That is explained in the text in 4.3. And they did estimate that that would take about 40 months in there. And so that's kind of just the brief overview of that one. So first one we'll talk about is the cap option. This is figure 6 from the feasibility study. And what they're going to do is kind of outlined in this blue color is kind of the waste material floor estimated extent. So kind of, you know, as it went down, the kind of the extent of where the waste was on the floor outlined in this blue. So that's what those kind of blue blobs are representing. But the red outlines that is surrounding the blue blobs, I'll call them, are kind of are the cap areas. So they're dividing it into 3 different caps, totaling almost 30 acres. I think it comes in just at 26.8 if you want to be precise. And there's a northern cap area, a southwestern cap area that includes the ravine, the low ravine area right in here, and then also kind of a central eastern cap right in here to cover up where the waste materials are. There will also be involved with this option discussed again on table 2 and 4.3, some grading involved because you need to divert the storm water, the overflow that's going to be on the site into a retention basin properly. So obviously you don't want to cause flooding on the road or anywhere else. So there's some engineering work involved with that. And you know, they put in the report, they expect it to take about 30 months to complete once they get all of permitting in place. Obviously there's going to be ongoing long-term operation and maintenance. The cap will need to be maintained, inspected, and all of that fun stuff. And they also include the estimated costs for these on the table so you can compare those. I believe, if I remember appropriately off the top of my head, the dig and haul, the excavation and whatnot was the most expensive. Obviously, you're driving a lot of waste across to different landfills. And then I think this was about the 3rd most expensive option based on their costs that they provided. And let's see, anything else I wanted to say about this? No, this is kind of what that option A was in 7.88, the 30-acre surface cap. Figure 8 is the landfill cell option. So this was option number 3 that they discussed in the feasibility study. This is figure 8 from the text that I just pulled to kind of give a visual to people so they can visualize it. So this would basically involve excavating the waste materials and the soil with the waste mixed in. Again, we kind of have those 3 main areas up here to the north. Over here on the south central southwestern side of the property, the ravine's kind of located down here. And then that other area, that's the south central kind of east side of the trenches, that would all be dug out, consolidated within. This is the acres, the 15-acre cell system in here, that it would be moved on top of a bottom liner that would be constructed. Everything would be moved inside of that. The surface cap would be constructed. And you know, there is some elevation to this. It's kind of hard to see on this two-dimensional map, but obviously when you put the waste in, it does kind of build up, and then there's kind of like a cap that comes up to a certain point because you have to have appropriate surface water runoff off the top of that. Again, there's requirements in that part 115 that would need to be met with this. Then you have this retention basin, again, that's going to collect the surface, the overland flow water appropriately. So there's no flooding there. Obviously, where things are dug up, some clean backfill would be needed to fill in those areas, so we're not leaving big holes on the property, and some grading as well. The time to implement this, they include, they estimated up to 38 months. Obviously, this is definitely going to have ongoing long-term operation maintenance, as well as a process will be needed for the collection of the leachate that's being created from this landfill cell. Will have to be collected and then appropriately disposed of off-site, or if any sort of specialized treatment system can be built to treat it, and different permits for that. So this is the landfill cell on-site containment. It's also called option. The cost, and again, is on table 2. So figure 9 is the pump and treat concept. This that they're proposing on this figure, you see these along the southern side of the House Street property right here. They call it possible recovery well locations. So there's 7 of those. They're spaced approximately 175 feet apart along the southern boundary. There's also this possible recovery trench that kind of goes between the wells. Again, obviously, when the water you're sucking out has to go through some piping over to a treatment building that would need to be constructed on site, that's going to treat the groundwater that you're pumping out of the ground. And then a couple things here. Either you treat the groundwater and then you have to obtain a permit through our water resource division for a groundwater discharge permit, because you can't just discharge groundwater like that on the surface without getting a permit. They also talk about, again, that whole possible deep well injection location, not a class 1 well, but a deeper well. Again, there's a lot of unknowns with that, and they do mention that a lot of modeling would be needed to know if that is even feasible. Likely, if a pump and treat option was done, it would be the treatment and then working with Water Resource Division to see if they could obtain a groundwater discharge permit for that. Obviously, you don't want to exacerbate any of the other contamination or waste, so you are kind of limited on areas where you can put that, but you know, that's kind of what that looks like. Each well would approximately generate 100 gallons per minute of water being sucked out of the ground. Estimated completion time would be about 12 months to complete, and none of these estimated times include like the time leading up to it with the permitting and whatnot, because some of those permits, depending on how involved they are, they do take a little bit of time. Us regulators like to review all those details, so those obviously have to go through their review time as well. So that's what option number 5 was, the pump and treat. And then option number 6 that they included in here is the phyto cap option, phyto remediation. And we'll go into more detail on the next slide, but this slide I just want to show this is just the concept, the phyto cap option concept figure. And in this light green area, again, we're over those kind of areas that were highlighted in purple on the earlier slide, where the wastes are located, the wastes in the impacted soils. This is kind of outlining the areas of where the plantings would be. You'll see 5 little baby caps, I'll call them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are existing surface caps, impermeable caps that are in place that were required to be installed under EPA's order and work that Wolverine did for them. Those were addressing non-PFAS chemicals and hazardous substances that required capping because they were within a certain distance of the surface at unacceptable levels. So those, had to be capped, or they just had very high concentrations of different types of non-PFAS, metals or volatiles that required this capping. So in this option, obviously, since we're not putting this option wouldn't require capping of this whole area. They're not proposing that. So those obviously have to stay because they have a reason that they're there for. And then down here is a little new cap, which is somewhat kind of in the ravine area that would be proposed to be installed, an impermeable cap down in that deeper ravine where we have some of the thicker sludges that we found. And so again, this outlined area would be where the tree plantings were located. Anything else I wanted to say here? Time they're estimating it would take is again 12 months, not including the permitting process. So figure 11 that Wolverine includes is kind of a rendering of a potential way that it could look. So again, here we have the little baby caps for the work done with EPA shown in this brownish color. The new capped area down here in the ravine area. And then these little circle green dots are representing the phytoremediation plantings. And so when you read in section 4.3.6, and on table 2 for this option, Wolverine's proposing to plant, they say, as many as 4,000 additional trees and herbaceous plants. Basically, the idea behind this proposed remedy is that they're saying they would be using the roots of the trees to passively uptake the PFAS from the sludges slowly over time. From my reading of the plan, I didn't see where it exactly identifies the exact species of trees that would be used here. It does make mention that spruce, willow, birch, and other herbaceous species of grasses and forbs have been shown in different greenhouse studies and a couple other studies on different projects, different scales of projects to absorb, to suck up the PFAS. Those are the types of species that have been shown to do that, at least in those studies, which is why I think they mentioned them here. But again, I didn't see exactly where it mentioned these are the ones that would likely come in a later plan if it got to there. The reported reduction in any infiltration of precipitation through the waste, this is taken right off table 2, would occur during the growing season. Obviously trees here in Michigan, not depending on the type, they're not growing all year round. So they're not using water necessarily all year round. So during really the growing season is when they're needing to drink more. And that's when they would be, holding and uptaking more water than during the non-growing season. There's talk in there about kind of a smaller fencing that will, obviously they'll have to fence around these little capped areas to maintain those. And then this newer cap area, I think that's what this picture here represents, kind of the gated access to the maintenance road there, the maintenance access gate, and then the little gates around those capped areas. And then obviously there is long-term operation and maintenance reference in here regarding what do you do with the trees when those start dying or need replacing, when they drop their leaves or needles, any detritus material from those trees obviously will have PFAS in it. So a long-term plan will need to be in place. They do mention that in the text, will need to be in place to address that forever into the future. Because obviously it is talked about a lot of the timing of this for these trees to be making substantial difference obviously is a very long time, you know, over 100 years or more. So that's also included on table 2 and in the text as well. So how does this remedy selection process actually work? I wanted to kind of break this down because it can basically blatantly, it can be confusing. So I want to try to make it as easy as possible to explain. So based on our review, obviously it's submitted to us. We're having to review it. We're having it open to public comment because we want to hear from you. We want the public's input on this to consider during our review. And based on that review, the draft feasibility study, there's really only 3 options that we have based on the consent decree and based on 201. It's either approved, approved with conditions, or denied. And so if the study is denied, then you know, there's a letter that's given to Wolverine. All of the deficiencies and issues and comments are laid out in that letter and given to Wolverine. And then at that point, Wolverine would then take that letter and address all of those deficiencies and resubmit a new plan. There's also another option that depending on our response to them, there's something called dispute resolution process. That is in the consent decree. And it basically provides, it's going to be a requirement if this does go to dispute resolution, it would be mandatory for us to go into. And I just want everyone to understand that if we go into that dispute resolution, we have to meet with the technical mediator. There's court, you know, requirements on this. And if an agreement cannot be reached, like let's say, you know, Wolverine and EGLE just can't come to an agreement with what the option needs to be, then in the consent decree, it's written in there in 7.8b, subject to dispute resolution, the minimum requirement, if no agreement can be reached, is approximately a 30-acre cap is required to be implemented by Wolverine. That's the minimum requirement that would be required if it gets to that point. So just wanted to make that clear here during this meeting. That's kind of the process. So obviously, once a remedy is chosen, depending on which path this takes, Wolverine must submit a work plan for that selected remedy to EGLE for review and approval within 180 days of the remedy being selected. So that's going to be the work plan that's going to have so much detail that it's almost going to be nauseating, but it's obviously needed because that's going to focus in on that one option, go over any sort of long-term monitoring, the finances, the performance, the implementation, the construction, the traffic controls, the air monitoring, the notification of the public, everything, every detail will be required to be in that work plan. So that will be due 180 days after the remedy selection. Then further down the line, and this is just kind of a requirement of the consent decree, but again, I wanted people to know that this exists. What's called a completion report is due within 2 years of Wolverine completing the construction of whatever remedy is selected and installed as required by the consent decree. And that completion report is required to include long-term operation, long-term maintenance, and then long-term monitoring as well. So that's the plan that's going to have all the long-term OM&M also included within there to document that for future generations, because obviously we're going to need that. Okay. And so during this public comment time, obviously we're taking written public comments through April 17th, 2021. They can be provided to, on the next slide, we'll give a little bit more information. They can be provided to our House Street email box, which is EGLE-RRD-HouseStreet@michigan.gov through April 17th. Then once we receive all of those comments, we prepare a responsiveness document that basically summarizes and addresses the public comments we have received. That document will be posted on our Belmont website as well, as just like the previous ones were for previous public comment periods. So that's that michigan.gov/Belmont website. And then kind of simultaneously, after we finish our review, after we get the public comments, then EGLE will complete our review and provide comments back to Wolverine. So that's kind of the general process of how this is going to flow. And so obviously, we'll be like a broken record repeating this. We do want to hear from you. This is a very important plan. You can continue to submit your written comments, again, April 17th. To that House Street email box. For those of you on the phone, I'll read it a little bit slower. It's EGLE-RRD-HouseStreet@michigan.gov, or you mail is perfectly fine. You can mail your comments to me at our Grand Rapids office. Again, that's Karen Vorse, EGLE-RRD. Our address is 350 Ottawa Avenue Northwest, unit number 10, and that's Grand Rapids, Michigan, 49503. And when you're submitting your comments, just make sure to note the plan you're commenting on. Obviously, we have multiple plans. We don't want there to be any confusion, so just make sure that's in the title subject line. We would be able to tell anyway, but it just keeps it clean for our administrative record. And if anyone has any questions and they don't want to ask them in front of everyone on this Zoom, or they need help with formulating their written comments or need any sort of assistance that way, please contact me. My work phone number is 616-439-8008, and my email address is vorsk, V as in Victor, ORCEK @michigan.gov. So feel free to reach out to me. That's what I'm here for. If you have any additional questions or need assistance with giving your official comments. And with that, I'll hand it over to Les again to remind everyone as we go into our next questions and any informal comments for the remainder of the meeting. I think he's going to go over the button and how that all works again.
Thank you, Karen. I was typing your contact information.
Oh,
in the
thank
chat.
you.
So, excellent presentation. Thank you, Karen, for providing us an overview of the feasibility study. I'm sure that there's lots of questions, and we have several that have come in so far. Just to remind everyone, I want to start with our folks on the phone because we have 4 on the phone. For those that are on the phone, to electronically raise your hand to talk to the panel tonight, you can push the pound and the number 2 key to have a conversation with our panel. Tonight's panel will include Karen Vorse, Abby Hendershot, or the Impart Executive Director, will be available for some questions, as well as Danielle Allison Yoakum as well. And I didn't mention earlier that I do have a couple of, at least one assistant with me. David Bambo is helping me behind the scenes as a co-host, and we do have Joshua Mosier, the Remediation Redevelopment Assistant Director, is on as just observing the webinar. So I just wanted to let you know that. And Karen, if you're ready, we do have several questions that have come in during the webinar. And I see that we have one hand raised so far. So I do see the hand raised, and we will get to several. We have several hands that are raised. So
Cool.
we have lots of questions coming in, and I just want to start with the first one we have that came in through the Q&A. So the first question concerns the either 20-acre or 30-acre surface cap. And the question is the clay the surface cap? Is clay the surface cap, and how deep is the surface cap? Whether, what is the depth there?
So the surface cap that will be installed is different than the existing soil lithology that's at the property. So the cap that will be installed, or that would be installed under that remedy in any of these options, when it says cap, it's an impermeable special geomembrane material that has to meet special specifications to be impermeable, preventing water from going through. So that is something that would be brought on site and installed over those areas. Whereas currently, the surface of the site, there is already a lot of clay kind of mixed in. That's just the natural environment of kind of the 10 to 20 upper feet of that site, depending on where you're at. A lot of the roads, when a lot of work was being done, gravel had to be put down because that clay was really slippery for those trucks. And even us, when we'd be walking on it, you'd kind of slip around. So there is kind of some natural clay sandy mix, obviously disturbed by all the trenches and former disturbances in those areas. But that's kind of on the site as well existing, but that's not considered, it's not a perfectly impermeable cap. When we're talking about the cap, it's the geotextile, engineered barriers. Hopefully that clarifies the difference between those two.
And Karen, you should mention too that any cap option that's evaluated will have to meet kind of those 115 standards for landfill caps, so that we're kind of meeting those substantive requirements under 115.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Karen and Abby, for answering that question. I'll take the next one here. Another question's come in and wants to know how many people were attending or are attending the webinar. So I've been monitoring that, and at one point at the height of the meeting, we had 66 attendees watching the meeting or listening in. Like as I've mentioned, we had approximately 4 people that were on by phone, and around a total of 66 attendees. That doesn't include the staff that are helping host the webinar. So hopefully that answers the question there. Next question. Question concerns why doesn't Wolverine World Wide take a more proactive role in the mitigation of the toxins using more state-of-the-art processes like on-site incineration?
I think that's a good question. I am not Wolverine, so I can't answer for them. Obviously, if you wanted, I would encourage you. You can actually reach out to Wolverine directly. They do have a phone number and an email address, and you can reach out directly to them. I can give you that right now. So they kind of have a phone line and an email address dedicated to this investigation. And so that phone number is 616-866-5627. Again, that's 616-866-5627. And they also have an email address, and that's housestreet, HOUSESTREET @www.inc.com. So housestreet@www.inc.com. And I think that would be a great question for them, kind of what their thoughts were putting together this feasibility study and why they chose to eliminate certain options in regards to others.
Okay, all right, thanks, Karen. Next question. Can you talk a little bit about the, there's a concern or or a comment raised about the leaves from the trees during during the fall, for example. Is there a concern there with the leaves being blown around and off property?
Yeah, so that would be, or obviously is a long-term concern that would need to be addressed specifically with this option, especially depending on the exact species and variety of trees that are used, especially if they're deciduous and do drop, or even conifers, they're dropping needles and other things. So obviously the bark, the leaves, the needles, the other parts of the trees, they will contain PFAS. We know through other studies, other sampling, that it does bioaccumulate in the plants. Their roots uptake it. Again, what rate depends on a lot of variables, depends on the site. But yeah, there will need to be somehow some sort of substantial plan and collection of that material, because obviously you don't want that PFAS being reintroduced into the ground or blowing off site.
Okay. Thanks, Karen. Next question, and they're coming in. We have several.
Good.
So keep them coming. The question about the cost for each remediation alternative. Can you touch on that a little bit about the cost of each of those?
Sure. So they are laid out on table 2 in the feasibility study itself. I didn't want to like repeat. I'm going to see if I can pull it up. I'll try pulling up the feasibility study itself, and we can kind of try to read through those. But again, it's laid out in the text in section 4.3. And then also in table 2, and they kind of give the permit and planning, design. They give a cost estimate for each remedy. Then they give the cost estimate for the construction of that remedy, and then they give an estimate for the long-term operation and maintenance, like the yearly cost kind of a thing, in that table as well. I wouldn't really want to bore people with reading off each option and then reading off the cost, but it is clearly stated in there in the plan.
People should go look at it for that kind of in-depth detail, because it's there on that table too, and it's on the website, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Karen and Abby. Next question. How do we get Wolverine World Wide to go the extra mile rather than just the default cap option?
Abby, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think that the consent decree laid up the objectives for what we were looking for House Street, and so the options that Wolverine has available to them, they could evaluate any of the options, and so I think that something above and beyond that is gonna take some input from the public on what you guys want to see. And so I would, use this time for public comments to really be able to voice those concerns and voice your, require your interest in doing some additional above just a cap type of remedies out here, because we, in the end, the consent decree was a negotiated settlement agreement, and we knew we wanted to make sure that the sources out there were capped, or at least at the very least capped and controlled, because this is a forever chemical. And so that was very important to us, but we didn't want to limit them from going the extra mile. And so, Wolverine has that option to be able to do that. So I think it's important that you guys reach out to them and discuss those concerns with them. And I see one here, Les, from on the length of the public comment period.
Yes.
Karen, I'm trying to remember the day that we actually posted this.
Yeah, this started back on March 11th. actually. So it's been going since March 11th through April 17th.
But we actually received it February 19th and
Yep, and posted it that next week, early that next week.
20th. So it's been posted.
It's been up since about late February.
Yeah, it's been posted for over a month now. Plus, then we incorporated at least 2 community advisory group meetings in there. So there was plenty of time for people to review it, ask us questions, and then for this particular meeting to occur. So you still got another 17 days to comment, and
Yep.
it should be enough time.
Yep, that was based on feedback from the community. We kind of worked with them on the timing of the comment period and what they wanted to see.
Okay. Another one of my co-hosts are going to help me with questions. So Laura Kane is going to help with the next series of questions.
Okay, the next question is, if Wolverine is proposing the phytoremediation cap solution, is there any record of them actually cutting down existing trees and evaluating to see if they show any evidence that PFAS absorption has occurred over the past decades? It seems logical that EGLE would require some proof. There seems to be no scientific proof that phytoremediation is effective with PFAS.
That's a really good comment. The the information on phytoremediation is still pretty much in its infancy stage. We know that phytoremediation can occur. We don't know at the varying concentrations that we have out here, but you would assume that there would be some sort of PFAS absorption that would have occurred through the existing trees already. And to my knowledge, I don't believe that any of the GZA studies have included any of that data. So that's something that, yeah, if that was the chosen option, there would have to be some additional evaluation to understand those considerations and what that means to the trees. And as Karen said, the foliage and how you manage that long term. Karen, anything you want to add to that?
No, other than that, there has been small scale studies that, we do know like different crops and things can uptake PFAS, but again, there are a lot of variables that depend on, the site conditions, the pH of the soil, what type of material you're dealing with, the type of species of the plant, its root systems, its growing seasons. There's so many variables that are involved that you can't really put a blanket statement on, each tree and this is how much it would have uptaked, over time. But I would say the trees that are growing at the House Street site right now in the sludges, in the waste materials, obviously those likely do have PFAS in them, and what those levels are, we don't know that at this time since we have not seen any sampling of that to date.
Okay, the next one is more of a comment, but I suppose we can ask it in the form of a question. What was typed was, thought there was only 83,000 cubic yards. Could you clarify how much cubic yards of waste exist at House Street?
So yeah, there's kind of the volume that includes the 3-dimension of, this is like if you were to dig it all up, here's a pile just of the waste material and just of the soil and waste material combined. That's 83,000 cubic yards. So you think of a cubic yard, how big a yard is, make that a box. 83,000 of those is the volume. So that's quite a bit. That's a big volume for a site. And the capping, again, for the surface, we're just looking a bird's eye view looking down. So just the extent of the horizontal, we're not including that vertical amount. The horizontal is where you get to approximately that 30-acre or so outline that the waste is located. Hopefully that kind of helps explain the difference between those two measurements.
Okay, the next question is, what is the approximate timeline for EGLE to make a decision on whether to approve, deny, or approve with conditions the current proposal from Wolverine?
So theoretically, there is no set in stone timeline associated with the consent decree. Obviously, we don't want to rush this. We want to be methodical and take into account all of the comments we receive. We have experts that are reviewing literature. We have engineers that are reviewing this. We have people like myself, geologists that are reviewing this. So there are quite a few eyes, you know, even as I speak, since we received the plan on February 19th, that we've been starting our review. And so obviously we don't want to hold anything up, but we also don't want to rush in and into anything. So the best I can say is we're going to try to, you know, move with expediency, but obviously also make sure we do a very thorough review and complete review at the same time.
Mhm. Incorporating all of the public comments. So, you know, our review is not done until we get all of the public comments and we can digest that information, take it into consideration, add it to our review and our, you know, we've got somebody also looking at the phytoremediation. We've got an expert in that. So we've got a lot of, as Karen said, outside expert help that we're calling in for this one because it is a little more complex. And we want to make sure we take the time to do it. We do have a few other plans that are down the pikes, so we're not going to take a ton of time, but we want to make sure we do it right. So I would hope by, you know, early summer, we're hoping to get this thing out the door and to you guys.
Thanks, Karen. So Laura, hang with me still. The next couple questions here are actually, there's a little bit of overlap here between our Q&A written and our hands raised. So I thought this might be a good time to jump over to our hands raised. Hopefully we can address those both at the same time. So I'm going to unmute one of our raised hands here. So just a moment. Oh, I lost the person. Moment.
I think she's there.
Yeah.
She took her hand down, but she
took her hand down. So I just wanted to give her an opportunity. Go ahead.
All right. There we go.
Hello?
There we go.
Are you waiting for me to make a comment?
Yes, you had a couple of questions and you also had your hand
Yay.
raised. Yes.
Oh
real
my
live
gosh,
person.
I finally figured it out. Okay. All right. I had two simple questions. Well, I don't know. Maybe I can combine them. I did want to know when Wolverine drilled those holes in the clay layer that allowed the PFAS to enter the groundwater, whether that was before or after 1966.
It was early on. I think there's a memo I remember coming across. Again, this was like mountains of paperwork we were going through. I want to say it was in the 40s.
In the 40s.
Or
okay.
Yeah.
So before 1966. Okay. Because as we look at this consent decree and this settlement, I know legally that it doesn't apply to Wolverine anymore, but part of their settlement with Plainfield Township on that site when Wolverine sued them was that they would not contaminate the groundwater, and they must have known that there were holes in the clay layer. So I just need to point that out for a historical reference here, which leads to the next question is, if for 50 years plus this went on and the site was forgotten by the township, seems to me by Wolverine, it seems to be by just about everybody, they didn't really, in my mind, follow through on the requirement of that consent decree. That's just my opinion, because they did contaminate the groundwater. So can they then exceed our expectations on this time around to kind of balance that out? Can they actually do more than the minimum? Because I think it's important to remind them that no one's stopping them from doing more. Is that true or not?
Nope, that's true.
Okay. All right. And then my last question, which is going to save some time, is this. It seems to me this is going to take a lot of time. It took 5 years for the EPA and DEQ to get back in and sample the tannery site after this was given back and forth between DEQ and Wolverine. 5 years passed from 2012 to 2017. And these things take time. Plans here, plans back, know this, know that. And while this is all happening, I recall reading, and I reread it again today, that in the consent decree, it does say that we can be looking at the same time at natural resources damage. And I'm upset, regardless, about this site and how, and I want it to be cleaned up, but I'm also quite upset as a citizen that the Rogue River is emptying into, well, the plume is entering into the Rogue River, and the level of PFAS is at 15 parts per trillion. At the tannery, it's 8 parts per trillion. By the time we get down to where the plume enters, according to maps, it's 15 parts per trillion. Now, you have a rule, Rule 57, that says that that exceeds Michigan's standards, which is 12 parts per trillion. So right now, every day, that plume is exceeding Michigan's standards. It is damaging the Rogue River and the whole watershed, for that matter of fact, regardless of wells. I don't understand why DEQ cannot require Wolverine to treat the water right there before it gets into the river. In addition, maybe to other things, of course, but stop it from getting into the Rogue River, because it's just going to go straight down to the Grand River and on its merry way to Lake Michigan. So I want to be clear about that. In the consent decree, all it says is in the future, the DEQ may, and I'm saying, do we have to wait 3-4 years? Or can that be looked at? Because I don't think that we can overlook that important fact.
No, it's definitely very important. I know Danielle, one of our assistant AGs, is on the line too, and she can kind of speak to the natural resource damages. That is something obviously that can happen. But before this plan, even Wolverine starting this back last fall in December, they did do pore water testing in the Rogue River because they have to show in order to show that there is groundwater venting into the Rogue River above criteria. That's the missing piece that we needed to show there is impact. And those samples were completed and done. That report is due to us April 25th.
Okay, that's really good to know. Yep.
So when we get that, then in that part of the consent decree, there's requirements for them to then, okay, we have the pore water sampling to likely show that there's an issue. Now they have to do, at least 4 quarters of, they could go a couple ways. They can go straight to, cutting off that source based on the pore water, or they can do 4 quarters of some sentinel wells to kind of get a better understanding of depth and space as to how those plumes are infiltrating into the Rogue. And then at that point, they have the opportunity to be like, okay, we're going to install this type of boundary system, this type of remedy to cut off that source, right?
Okay.
So that is definitely in the consent decree and is a requirement. It's just not talked about part of this since it's kind of its own arm, but connected, obviously very important and connected.
Yeah. Okay, because again, all these plans and whatever, it's like the faucet's on all the time, 365 days a year, 24/7. We need to turn the faucet off so this water is not entering our river. And frankly, I care very much that years don't go by. And I know that can happen with these sorts of things. And I hope Wolverine realizes that this is far bigger than the impact, which is horrible enough on so many people's lives with their drinking water. But this is 25 square miles, and this is far bigger than just. Yeah, you get it. I don't need to go over and over. That's it. All right, I'm done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But Lynn, to your point, there will be additional meetings and discussion on all of the GSI issues and the proposals. So we'll connect with you and make sure that you're aware of those as those come up. But you're going to get really good meetings by the end.
Yeah, I just am, and I am really concerned that the larger public, the fishermen, Trout Unlimited, all these organizations understand that there's a lot at stake here, and it's not a time to waste time.
Right.
So, thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
Okay, I'm going to unmute the next hand that is raised because it's in line with the next question. Okay, your mic is on mute. You have a question for the panel?
Yes, thank you for allowing the opportunity to speak here. One of our concerns and our questions is whether EGLE and the EPA would consider a combination of the options that have been proposed to address both the soil and the water contamination. And the reason for that question is it seems that the 30-acre cap solution addresses the soil and the infiltration of the contaminants into the water, but it does not address the actual cleanup of the water that's already been contaminated in the aquifer. And likewise, the pump and treat solution only addresses the water contamination that's currently happened, but it doesn't address the continuation of the leaching into the aquifer. So it seems that the objective should be, and I'm sure it is on your part, to stop the infiltration of the contaminants into the aquifer, but also to clean the water within the aquifer. And I think that that would go back to Ms. McIntyre's solution of doing some sort of a pump solution there at the Rogue River. But to do less than both of these objectives and meeting both of those would be not a full solution. So that's my question is, will EGLE be looking at a combination of those options that were proposed?
I mean, we would obviously, as they were proposed to us, unfortunately, they were not proposed as options piled on each other. But in the future, if, a new plan is needed to be submitted, for sure, a combination of remedial options would not be overlooked if it is feasible and meets the goals and even exceeds the goals. There's definitely more than one way, you could try to address this, thinking outside the box.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, it just seems that if we allow the perpetrator to drive the process, then we won't have an accurate or full solution to this problem. It seems that the state needs to, give the direction of meeting those objectives. And if the 30-acre solution does not meet the full objective of cleaning the soil and the water that's already been contaminated, then they should be able to direct, the attention back to Wolverine to find a solution that will combine several of those solutions, or maybe a few of them, to meet those combined objectives.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree with you as to your comments, and I think that is something that we understand, I think, because it's pretty obvious that if you cap the house street plume, but don't clean up the groundwater, then you have to address it at where it discharges out of into the river. Exactly. So it's either one or the other or both. So we're open to those types of solutions. As Karen says, that wasn't a combination that was proposed to us, but we certainly wouldn't be opposed to it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and we have to kind of follow like how our laws are in Michigan. It's kind of a performance-based remedy as well. So whatever the remedy is, proposed, we just need to make sure that it does meet those objectives. XYZ. So we're not prescribed, we don't usually prescribe to liable parties how to meet the objectives or law. There is sort of a allowance of them coming up with the plan. The burden is on them, but we do provide comments. Obviously, we will be providing questions we have or comments we have, things that don't align, that do align with this plan back to them that they then, would need to address, kind of a thing. That's how it's been with all the other plans. But no, I agree. I think that, there always is more than one way to address a problem, and thinking kind of outside the box here, it would definitely be beneficial.
Right. And I don't mean to labor the issue, but I just need to point out in the dissent, in the dissent decree, there was an agreement with Wolverine that if an agreement could not be obtained or reached as to the solution, that they would be committed to, at minimal, the 30-acre cap. And that in itself does not even meet both of the objectives of cleaning the soil and cleaning the water that's already been contaminated. So I'm a little confused about.
So yeah, I can read the objectives again for you in A and B. Let me find my notes here.
That's okay. I don't mean to take up your time.
No, that's okay. It's important. So 7.8A, little I. So manage solid waste at the house street and reduce and control potential migration of PFAS compounds from soils and sludges. So it really is focused on the source control remedial objective. Obviously, because unfortunately, if you do look at the area that we're dealing with and the depth of the aquifer and how far it's made it, the main thing we really need to focus on right now above anything else is, of course, cutting ongoing bleeding into that aquifer, cutting off the source. And then also, that's why we also have the investigation offsite with cutting it off to the next receptor of the river as well, which is part of that GSI investigation. Okay. So that's kind of how it is written in the consent decree, with managing any solid waste that are generated on the site, and then reducing and controlling potential migration of PFAS offsite from those soils and sludges.
Okay, thank you so much for clarifying. And how would we be able to be involved or listen in on these conversations relative to the secondary? I'm sorry, you just referenced.
Yeah. Yes. No. Yeah. So. Yep. So on our website, you'll be able to see the plans as well on the www.michigan.gov/Belmont. There's also, they've been meeting monthly, once a month on Thursday evenings, a Wolverine Community Advisory Group, Wolverine CAG. It is a community-led through some funding through the US EPA that has a bunch of people on this community advisory group, and the state attends, and the townships and cities in the area, and we definitely talk about a lot of these plans. So yeah, there's definitely a lot that is going on, and it's hard to keep track. So we try to give updates during those meetings. So if you go to, I think it's wolverinecag.org.
Yes, I'm familiar.
Okay, sorry.
No problem.
That, I would say that's a really good place to start to listen into those monthly meetings as well as our website. But I know a website isn't the same as meeting with people to talk. And
yes, okay.
Plus, Karen, all of the public comment periods and public meetings like this will be on the MPART website.
True.
Calendar piece as well. So if you subscribe to all of the MPART updates, you'll get those notices as well of public upcoming public meetings and public notice periods. So that's another way to do it. So we've got a number of hands yet and a number of questions.
Yes, we have a number of questions, and there's a few hands that are raised. and there's overlap of those. So maybe we can again continue to combine these as we go. So I'm gonna, the next question actually has, the questioner has a hand raised. So I'm going to unmute the next person
Cool.
and go ahead. Do you have a question for the panel tonight?
Yep, this is AJ Birkbeck. I'm on the Wolverine CAG, also the technical committee. And I just wanted to, my first thing was a comment, and that is Wolverine indicated that they would be giving us modeling that would show, you know, how each of these options would affect the spreading of the plume. And I think that's, before we can really comment in too much depth, those are critical questions. You know, comparing option to option, you know, would one option impact a lot more houses 50 or 100 years down the line versus another option? So we're anxious to get that. We've been told we'll be getting that information next week, along with the timeline that indicates how long each one of these might take to actually reach regulatory levels. The question I had, and it relates to a couple of things that have already been said. Obviously, one of the things we want to do is to contain the contamination at the dump as opposed to letting it spread. So there's going to have to be something done at the site that limits infiltration, you know, perhaps some capping that's different than what's currently proposed. But the second goal, which is to control migration, I think we really need to look at, you know, what is, now that there's so many people are on public water or with filters, what is the real next point of human and environmental exposure? And, you know, I've heard it from a couple of commenters. It really is, you know, where the plume hits the road. And separating those two issues, I think, is a mistake. I said this at our last two meetings on this. I think we really need to not separate the fact that we know there's contamination of the rogue by that plume. That currently the consent decree gives, I think, a couple of more years to do a formal analysis of that. But I would say we don't need that formal analysis. We know there's impact there because before the rogue hits the House Street plume, it's below the 12 parts per trillion threshold that's been set by the state. Afterwards, it's above it. And fish there are being impacted. It's bioaccumulating. And I think that we should really ask Wolverine to consider an option that would address, you know, not only the House Street landfill or dump with some capping, but also really look at the point where it really is impacting human health and the environment, which is down at the rogue, and not wait a couple of years for the GSI. So in other words, to incorporate that as part of a proposal not yet made. And, you know, I've already requested this of Wolverine in our prior comment sessions. The question I had, is that something that EGLE and or the AG's office would consider if Wolverine were to put forth, and I'm not saying they would, who knows, but were to put forth a proposal that addresses not only, you know, what's flowing off of House Street, but also simultaneously addresses what's going on at the rogue, where that plume is hitting the river, and possibly speed up that process a little bit. So is it something that would be considered by the state?
I think obviously any proposal by Wolverine to speed up the requirements of the consent decree would be welcomed and accepted by the state, recognizing the amount of work that is necessary in the North Kent study area. All of these projects were phased out over a period of time, recognizing that both the time and monetary commitments that would have to be made to accomplish them. So of course, we would always welcome addressing those issues simultaneously and together. But the consent decree does envision allowing some different points in time in which those particular issues need to be addressed.
But there are deadlines. There are, it's not like this can go on forever.
Mm.
We can't study this forever. They have specific timeframes in each one of those to be able to give us something that's approvable and implementable, if that makes sense. So yes, AJ, we would always welcome something that is above and beyond. But as Danielle said, we've got it laid out in the consent decree. Just from the practical trying to implement all of this at once it was quite a big ask in the consent decree.
Yeah,
Right,
and the
I guess the context would be, theoretically, if you're dealing with all the receptors, in this case, the river and the where the plume is hitting the river, it may make less sense to spend a lot of money on a 30-acre cap, which probably won't do much to control the plume at the perimeter. We're dealing with the folks that are already in the plume. What I'm trying to do is to propose something that would prevent or mitigate additional or new contamination at the same time. So, there would probably be a little bit of a trade-off there, because the cost of doing both of these things together would be probably significantly greater than the cost of any one of these proposals. But it would be more effective at cutting off, human and plant and animal receptors.
Mhm. Good comments, AJ. Thank you. We'll look for your written suggestions and proposals and comments
Thank you, Annie.
For our comment period. Thank you.
Okay, there I am. All right, so the next series of questions here. This one concerns the cap. If the landfill is capped, what grows on top of the cap? And if it is trees, will the roots cause further infiltration of rain? It's a great question.
Yeah. So usually they do some type of grasses that don't have an extensive root system on top of these caps. I've seen wildflowers and things, but yeah, where the cap actually is, there wouldn't be large trees that could be planted on it, because you're exactly right. Their roots could puncture the impermeable cap that is beneath it. So usually there is soil that's put on top of this cap, and smaller plants and things can be planted on them, and have been at other sites.
Okay. But you do want to maintain that cap, because otherwise, if you get some of those Russian olives and some of those species get really aggressive, and you can't get them to go away, and then they're infiltrating your cap material.
Well, hey, thank you, Karen and Abby, for the answer. I want to jump to a question here, sticking with the trees and the cap conversation. The House Street dump already is covered with trees, so how would adding more trees reduce the PFAS contamination?
That's a good comment. I think that should, definitely be something to consider. I know that, depending on the type of trees, certain trees have been documented to be more, better at uptaking contaminants than others. But yeah, a lot of the House Street site is currently covered in vegetation as it is right now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Karen. This next question is more of a access type question. Will the property be able to be used for walking or hiking with any of these options that were proposed?
I think any of the options as are written currently, I don't think involve that. I did see that Wolverine had mentioned in the phytoremediation option, there's the potential for in the future for there to be some sort of nature trails or something. But again, that was not included within this plan of it actually showing the walking paths and laying that out.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Next question, the author of the question has their hand raised. So I'm going to unmute their mic so they can ask their question. You have a question for the panel?
I don't see that she's unmuted yet.
Yeah. No, I don't see, not responding to the request to unmute. So the question, while we're seeing if she can unmute her mic, is can you provide any link to the studies you referenced that have been done to date on the effectiveness of phytoremediation?
Yeah, so in the feasibility study, there is a references section. I believe it's section 6. And from my recollection of looking at those, there's a little bit of a list of them. There are at least 3 resources, 3 references on there that specifically deal with some different research or at least some study that has dealt with phytoremediation or plant studies. So one of them, they're kind of long. I would recommend you email me and I can give you these. I'll try to read them out quickly right now. One of them is, plant uptake of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances at a contaminated fire training facility to evaluate the phytoremediation potential of various plant species. The first author on that is Laura Gobelius, Gobelius. So I'm sure if you Google her name, Laura Gobelius and plant uptake, that research will come right up. Yeah. Another one is by David Hoff, I think was his first name, D. Hoff. And again, that's accumulation of 6 PFAS compounds by woody and herbaceous plants, potential for phytoextraction. That was the second one. And the third one was uptake and accumulation of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances in plants. The first author being WENFENG was their first name, last name WANG. So
they should probably email you or grab it off of the plan itself.
Yeah, they're listed in the resources in the plan, but those would be the ones to look for in the long list.
We have, it is 7:47 and we have still 6 more questions.
Okay.
We should probably try to wrap this up by 8 so people don't go too far over our allotted time.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I see there's some more questions about the trees and the landfill cap in here. So before I get to that, there's a question about how will the actions proposed affect other contamination found at the site?
Yep, that's something that obviously our consent decree specifically deals with PFAS, right? Because we have regulations for that in the state. But there's also, kind of also going on is we know it does not have the offsite migration issues, fortunately, with the metals and the VOCs that's similar to the PFAS, but we know it is on site. So obviously, whatever they do for PFAS, they cannot be exacerbating or making worse, I guess I should say, the other contaminants, because there is still evaluation and work going on with US EPA and doing some additional work for the non-PFAS compounds, the metals and VOCs. So obviously, it would be in everyone's best interest that they not make any contamination that's there that's not PFAS any worse than it currently is. And that's also something that needs to be taken into account with the phytoremediation. Obviously, it's not just going to be PFAS that's going to be potentially taken up by these trees. There is other contaminants in there, and understanding that and how they impact each other and influence and compete for storage in the tree is definitely something that will need to be considered with this plan.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Jump down, there's a question about tree roots. Would tree roots go down far enough into the water table to make a difference?
Yep, that's a good question. I think it definitely will depend on the type of tree you have. you know, and I'm not a botanist, that's why we do have some plant specialists looking at this, who this is what they live and breathe and have studied and have done research on. But again, yeah, that is a concern. 20 feet is really deep for tree roots to get down to. Usually they're spreading outward laterally, because obviously they want to get as much surface water that's coming down as possible, right? That's not going to be down necessarily, it's what's coming from the surface. So I think that definitely is something that we're having our experts look at. You know, how deep do some of these trees roots actually go, because some of the waste we have is, again, pretty deep, and that is something that we want to make sure would be addressed.
Abby and Karen, the remaining questions seem to be about the offsite locations.
Yeah, I think we can probably answer the first one. Can a mixing zone be used for GSI? And that is not allowed with PFAS. So
it's bioaccumulative.
you know, we do not give mixing zones for any of the PFAS compounds because they're bioaccumulative. So that's not allowed under our laws. So that cannot be an option that they can consider. We've got some that talk about some of the stuff coming out of Wellington Ridge and 11 Mile, and the what Wolverine's going to do with some of that contamination. Again, that is going to be, some of that's going to be incorporated into the groundwater surface water interface plans that are going to, there's a couple areas over by the 11 Mile and Jewel area that they're going to be investigating to take that pore water sample to see if.
Well, they already did, yeah. We're
just
just waiting on that report now, which is due April 25th.
Thank you.
Yep.
And that will help us to see what's actually, if it's actually getting into the Rogue River, at what levels, and if it exceeds water quality values, then they should be proposing something. So hopefully that takes care of that one. And I think, so our last one is, if a well-designed and constructed cell and cap system is selected as a remedy, can it be used to in turn other PFAS materials from other sites, since PFAS is not a regulated substance at the federal level? I think what this person is saying is whether or not they could actually turn it into a functioning landfill to accept additional waste, and that is not was not considered as an option under this plan. And I don't think Wolverine would want to construct something that's up to today's standards for a 115 operating landfill, nor do I think they want to operate a hazardous substance landfill of their own, which I think is what this person was talking about. So I think that's most of our questions.
Okay. So thank you, Abby and Karen, for helping us get through. These are excellent questions that were being raised in comments. Karen, you want to just as we get ready to close out this evening's conversation, just to reiterate how to reach out to you and the closing of the public comment period?
Yeah. So again, please get us your written comments by April 17th. You can email them to our House Street email box. It's that EGLE-RRD-HouseStreet@michigan.gov, or you can mail them in the mail to our Grand Rapids office. That's 350 Ottawa Avenue Northwest, Unit 10, Grand Rapids, Michigan 49503. And if we didn't get to your comment or question during this Zoom meeting and you have follow-up information, feel free to call me or email me. My info is listed there, but again, my email address is vorcek@michigan.gov. And again, we just thank you for your time. We appreciate you providing your comments, and hope to talk to you guys soon.
And I want to just say from the higher perspective of MPART, that this public comment period is vitally important. And so that, you know, as Karen said, we thank you for providing those written comments to this process. This is, you know, one of the many options that we have for including you guys and your comments and letting the you know, the neighbors, the friends, the families that have been affected by PFAS actually have a voice at the table. So we take these comments very seriously, and we're always here to listen and talk with you if you've got other concerns, or if you want to talk about something totally unrelated, we're here. We'll talk to you as well. So thank you for coming.